now. Okay. So before I introduce our guests properly, maybe a few words on cIDA. There's a few new names, which is always great that you're tuning in. As I said, it's located within the Department of Government and loosely associated with a few like-minded departments and centers around the world, like Desire in Brussels, or the Populism Study Circles in Thessaloniki, Populism Research Group in Loughborough. And we have this internal PhD colloquium, where we present our own research, where we maybe sometimes have visiting PhD students, visiting scholars, and then also these more public events where we invite researchers from other universities that come from kind of like, let's say, adjacent disciplines to what we're doing, maybe from critical theory, continental philosophy, sociology, psychoanalysis, and so on. And this time on semiotics. And I find these exchanges personally very fruitful because it always helps to get a somewhat of an outsider view of the topics we are concerned with. Maybe we have to rethink the things we take for granted, and just kind of like getting this different perspective and coming out of this departmentalizing of modern academia is something that I really enjoy, and I think our two guests for today embody that very well. The plan will be that we will have a presentation for approximately 30 minutes. Anna, if you can mute yourself, that would be excellent. Thank you. And then we have 10 minutes reserved for our discussant, Daniela, today, who actually works with cultural and political semiotics. So we wanted to reserve some time for her to pose some questions and make some comments. And then we open the floor up for general discussions. So our guests today are Peeter Selg and Andreas Ventsel. Peeter is a professor for political theory at Tallinn University in Estonia, and his research interests are theories of power, social science and methodology, and relational social sciences. He published recently together with Andreas, Introducing Relational Political Analysis, Political Semiotics as a Theory and Method. And this book is really the culmination of many years of working together, which includes articles like Towards a Semiotic Theory of Hegemony, naming as Hegemonic Operation in Lotman and Laclau, or An Outline for a Semiotic Theory of Hegemony. Andreas is Associate Professor of Semiotics at Tartu University, and his research is interdisciplinary, focusing on semiotics, discourse theory, visual communication, strategic communication, rhetoric and political analysis, and especially post-structuralist political thought. And together with Marilise Madison, he recently published Strategic Conspiracy Narratives, a Semiotic Approach with Routledge in 2020. That would be it from my part. If you are ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I shall share my screen. So, so can you see the slides?
Yes.
So thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure and actually a huge honor to be in this panel or in this seminar, because it doesn't happen too often that the people you're not only citing in your work, but actually quoting in your work are listening to what you are trying to say. I remember in 2008, actually, I had the opportunity to be in the same panel or session in the first conference or inaugural conference on a Congress in Ideology and Discourse Analysis, when the keynote speaker was none other than Ernesto Laclau, and we shared the session with Jason Kleinas and David Howard. Of course, the downside of this situation was that all the attention went to the now highly celebrated book Logics of Critical Explanation. Back then, actually, we have even met, and sat around the same table. Well, first of all, the input I'm trying to give you here is related to what we call relational political analysis. So let's start with the very basics. Is it political analysis or analysis of politics, or is it political semiotics? Sorry, putting the Zoom link in the very corner of the screen. Is it political semiotics or semiotics of politics, or is it relational analysis or analysis of relations? So we are trying to bring in relational as a meta-theoretical qualifier, in a sense that we can talk about relational sociology, relational approach to something, relational concept, relational notion. It is sort of like a way of approaching reality, but often relational is used as a theoretical qualifier, relational domain, relational field, relational dimension of something, relational power, besides other forms of power like institutional, structural, and so on. So relations or relational domain seems to be one object among others, but for us, it is quite clear that the relational approach to power is not the same as an approach to relational power. So in my subjective perception, relational sociologists, as we know them these days, and I come to this notion a little bit later, get the difference, but when it comes to relational political scientists, usually they don't see the difference. So what is for us the crucial notion of governance that we more or less theorize about? It's a very simple definition, but of course, simple is probably in the quotation marks. Governance is none other than power exercised to address problems. So in that sense, well, there are many difficulties involved in this notion. On one hand, we can say that power is not only an analytical or descriptive notion, it's always a normative one. But the simple formula, governance equals power exercised to address problems, poses at least three interrelated issues or problems. What is power and its exercise? And what are problems in the first place? And what does addressing mean? So we are kind of like in between normative and analytical distinctions. But what are problems? Here I go very briefly over some tables we have in the book. We can basically distinguish between four different kinds of problems. Of course, the distinction is not an ontological one, but rather an analytical one. We can talk about simple problems where there's an agreement all over the place. We know what is the problem and what to do about it. We can talk about complex problems where there's an agreement on what the definition of the problem is, but at the same time there's a often quite heated disagreement on what to do about it. And wicked problems, one of our research interests over the past 5 or so years is a situation where there's a disagreement all over the place. We don't really agree on what the problem is, and we are hugely divided by what to do about it. But logically, there's a fourth option, and I think that one of the messages from this book is the situation that often politics involves deproblematizing problems. We don't agree on what the problem is, but we still have an agreement. Well, we could say hegemonic agreement on how to solve whatever societal problems, whether it's a balanced budget or something like that. It's considered to be a panacea for whatever social problems. But when it comes to this disagreement-agreement axis, we shouldn't ignore another aspect of when it comes to wicked problems. We have to take into account that actually there is not only a serious disagreement all over the place when we talk about wicked problems, but there is also complexity and uncertainty. So what is uncertainty? Well, and complexity. When it comes to complexity theory, it's often a rejection of the validity of analytical strategies in which things are reducible to the sum of their parts. So, and on the other side, complex systems, especially complex adaptive systems, are always on the move. They are mutating from one phase into another. So there is no stability. The contingency of the social is always looming large, we could say. So just an example, COVID-19 crisis, which we have written quite recently, still forthcoming a paper from my colleagues at Tallinn University, where we tried to bring it into sociology. But what is COVID-19 crisis? Is it a health crisis? I don't think it is anymore. It's also an economic crisis, geopolitical crisis. One of the things we want to emphasize, which was not discussed in the book because it was submitted early 2020, right before the COVID-19 crisis. We talked about migration crisis and stuff like that. We were in our comfort zone, so to speak. But one thing that we are experiencing at the moment very much is it's also an epistemic authority crisis. The question of knowledge has entered the scene. What is the criterion of knowledge? There is no authority in many ways in the establishment in terms of science and often government, and the often still, I'm glad to say, oppositional parties who have the populist agenda, they are resonating this epistemic authority crisis. They put into question the entire established knowledge about the virus and so on. So we are experiencing it very, very strongly in Estonia, for instance, where the indicators of COVID-19 are the worst in the entire world, not only Europe. Anyway, the book we're talking about here, Introducing Relational Political Analysis, I'm very briefly going over the outline of the book and focus a little bit more on certain more specific features of it. Of course, we are talking about the relational turn in the social sciences. What does it mean to have a relational approach, and how people from very different fields, ranging from sociology to political science and even, I would say, history writing, what do they have in mind? So then we go on very, I would say, excessively long chapter, about 60 pages, on what does a relational approach to the political entail. We talk about the three crucial notions of power, governance, and democracy, and actually see the Essex School's understanding of hegemony as underlying all of them. Power in terms of hegemony, governance in terms of addressing problems through various hegemonic configurations, and how can power be more or less democratical, or in what sense. So then we reflect on different versions of semiotics. What we are talking about more today, I guess, is a framework of political semiotics. We are talking about what we call the political logic of the semiosphere, and we are trying to put forth certain categories through which we can analyze different hegemonical configurations from the viewpoint of power, governance, and democracy. And we take recourse to the discussions that were developed in very much detail in Kleiner's and Howard's intervention from 2007, which I already mentioned, and tried to make sense what does semiotic explanation mean, and how it is essentially related to abductive research logic. And we even have an ambition to illustrate, hopefully convincingly, you never know, our approach in terms of methods, which we call political form analysis, and we utilize in one of the examples related to the digital threats crisis that Estonia had something like 4 years ago. So this is the outline, but the kind of chapter on which we probably should focus the most today is that we try to bring the cultural semiotic tradition of the Tartu-Moscow School into a dialogue with the Essex-based discourse, analytical, post-structuralist discourse, theoretical school. And what we basically do there is that we try to show how the categories, or let's say the terms of different origin, have actually the same conceptual logic. So we use different terms, but at the same time, the conceptual logic is very similar. On the one hand, we have Essex School with their notions of nodal points, empty signifiers, antagonism, and then of course hegemony. On the other hand, we have the notions like discrete and continuous coding from the Tartu-Moscow School. We have the notion of text and semiosphere, and we try to bring out how they can mutually actually complement each other. We are not saying one or the other, but it seems that one of the major achievements, let's say, or major contributions of the Essex School of Discourse Analysis is that they bring in the political logic of meaning making. They put it at a very central place. At the same time, the Tartu-Moscow School of Cultural Semiotics has been well, I wouldn't say ignoring, but underemphasizing the political logic of meaning making. But their research interests, and of course the era of Soviet times, which was the main era of the emergence of these ideas, hasn't allowed them to come to terms with the political consequences of their theorizing. So they mutually, and at the same time, the cultural semiotic tradition has been trying to work out typologies of culture, different forms of communication. So they have developed further from that point of view. So they are mutually like complementing each other rather than being an either or choice. One of the important messages I think from cultural semiotics is that that communication and culture are organically, inextricably linked. So we can pose the problem of political semiotics or political analysis, for that matter, in terms of analyzing different forms of communication. And what we talk about in this book, we want to point out that cultural semiotics and discourse theory of the post-structuralist manner are deeply relational. They try to avoid process reduction as far as possible. They take the contingency of the social, the contingency of the cultural, for that matter, very seriously. Underlying these is the distinction that comes actually from one of the, by now we could say, a classic work by John Dewey and Arthur Bentley, is the distinction between self-action, interaction, and trans-action. And the table I'm indicating here tries to summarize it. How do we understand social relations and social processes? Do we consider them to be as owned? If we analyze social processes, do we look for the instigators of those processes, or do we reify them as variables in case of interaction, or do we consider relations as being constitutive and the social process is not reducible to any owner or not to be reified? So can we actually consider social processes or social problems, for that matter, as kind of unowned processes? And So basically what we come up with in synthesizing these different perspectives and actually trying to demonstrate that both are deeply relational in a sense that they consider social relations as constitutive and as essentially processual is summarized in chapter 6 in this table when we put forth a set of concepts for analyzing democracy, power, and governance from the viewpoint of metaphoric and metonymic, or from the viewpoint of, for instance, discrete and non-discrete coding, which is, in our view, pretty similar to the logic of difference and equivalence in Laclau and Moff's and others terms, or as we call them, the logics of deproblematization and problematization, or based on those syntheses, we could even say that the democratization and democratization is also what we are talking about here. I'm just checking the time. How much time do I have? Or do I have? But
you have a little bit more time, maybe 5, 6, 7 minutes, I would say.
Yeah. Okay. Then I'm presuming that at least some of you have also read the chapters. But what we basically do there is we extract from theories of power, governance, and democracy certain logic of articulation, we could say, certain logic of translation in the Tartu-Moscow School terms, but since the notion of articulation is probably more familiar to you, I'm sticking to that. So how different logics can interplay in society, how you can have a certain form of governance on one, let's say, sphere or section of the social formation, and totally different in the others. So we try to put forth a kind of like a multi-dimensional notion of democracy, and these forms of different public communication. We borrow from a great influencer of the Tartu-Moscow School and one of the most eminent linguists of the 20th century, Roman Jakobson, who talks about emotive communication, you know, the orientation of expressing emotions and feelings, who also talks about fatigue communication, leading back to Bronislaw Malinovsky's notion of ritualized stereotype kind of communication, and also the poetic communication, which we consider one of the major mechanisms of creating equivalences. Also as equivalences between differences, also discussed by Jakobson himself in that sense. And connotative orientation, connotative communication, you are saying, hey, you there, do that. You're interpolating in a kind of like an Althuserian sense. And then there's referential communication, which we associate with deliberative or network kind of governance. And finally, metalingual orientation, when we actually are questioning the code we are following in addressing problems, so that we relate to meta-governance or agonistic form of democracy. So basically what I'm also pointing here out as a way of initial input, we can come to the discussion, is that actually the table you had here is kind of like a deductive presentation, but what we want to move to is kind of like an abductive presentation of those semiotic categories, for which we can use for constitutive explanation, and we go on at some length in demonstrating, at least we hope we're able to demonstrate it, that a relational approach presumes always constitutive explanation, not classical causal explanation, which we even call the art of separation. But when it comes to relational constitutive explanation, you can consider the elements separately, but not as being separate. And here, especially, we hopefully not very much misinterpreting Jason Kleiner's and David Howarth's intervention, where they, I would say thus far, one of the most thoroughgoing treatments of abductive or retroductive reasoning. So our idea is, of course, that these categories are not some sort of deductive hypothesis we try to test, but actually their meaning is also articulated within the analytic or explanatory process. And that's probably quite familiar for those who have consulted Kleiner's and Howard's book. And well, this is where I would actually kind of stop talking for a while. We also tried to put forth a method which we call political form analysis. But for us, of course, political form is not some sort of formal structure or something. It's a logic of articulation. How are certain contents organized so that their relations are constituted, or how certain meanings are constituted through the relations, let's say, mundane way to put it, or not even mundane, but non-technical way to put it is the idea that you can be pretty totalitarian about freedom, but you can at the same time be very democratic about slavery. So the content doesn't determine the political constitution of society. It's the form, or actually, of course, their mutual relationship. So that's in brief my input. So maybe we can move to the discussion now. Thank you.
Sounds good to me. Thank you so much for this overview. I think that should actually serve as a really nice basis for discussion. If you could unshare your screen so that we can see each other.
Just a moment. Stop share.
Excellent. Okay, I will now hand over the floor to Daniela in a second. She's also a PhD student here in Ideology and Discourse Analysis at the University of Essex. And there she examines the concepts of human rights, where she employs in her research then discourse theory, and as I said, also cultural semiotics and political semiotics as just presented. And that's why we asked her to kind of like be the discussions for this session. Take it away, Daniela.
Yeah, thank you, Julius. And thank you, Peter, for the presentation. And actually, thank you very much for your book. I mean, this is how I reacted to your publication, actually. I feel quite honored, but also excited to be discussant on your book. Maybe a bit of my background to make it a bit clearer how I approach your book and your theory. So I earned my bachelor's degree in cultural studies and linguistics myself with a specialization in Slavic studies and German studies. So this is kind of an explanation for how I learned about semiotics, and in particular also cultural semiotics with the model of Yuri Lotman and his model of the semiosphere. They played quite a major role for me in, so that I also applied it already for in my bachelor's thesis actually. And then when I went on to do my master's, I entered the area of political science. And there again, I was kind of determined to use Lotman's model and the semiotics. And this is when I started looking for previous applications of semiotics in politics. And this is how I found your works and your articles about political semiotics. And only through your works have I ultimately come to read Laclau and Mouffe's work in first place. So yeah, it's probably a bit different from my fellow colleagues in IDA. And while reading Laclau and Mouffe's book, I was kind of struck by the similarities to semiotics. So I very much agree with what you're writing, particularly in chapter 4 about how there's no mentioning of semiotics in this book, although you can read it that way. Yeah, so chapter 4 pretty much reflects my own thoughts of this. I also think that your explanations of how semiotics are very dynamic and not as structurally fixed as it is often perceived as. So your interpretation of semiotics as trans-actional, I think, is very accurate and so very helpful actually also for my own work. With this book or in this discussion, I would like to focus more or stronger on the combination of cultural semiotics and post-structuralist theory. So actually my first or biggest question I have to you both is, you are mentioning that that cultural semiotics and discourse theory, discourse analysis are mutually complementing each other, yet they don't seem to be completely not similar in a way that they can be that they can replace each other. So I was wondering whether you could expand a bit and explain what actually the difference is between them, what makes them not similar enough to replace each other. So what do they gain from each other to be complemented? So that would be my first question to you.
Okay, I will start if I may.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for questions. One of our reasons was to complement these analytical tools, which is proper for and elaborated for cultural exploring cultural phenomenon and elaborated by Juri Lotman and other members of Tartu-Moscow School is somehow give more deep approach to explaining how cultural phenomenon and political phenomenon related each other. And as we know, some authors accused also Laclau that Laclau's theory is too abstract. They agree that this hegemonical logic is very well elaborated, but not to give as much tools for concrete analysis. No. And I think this Kleino's book is a good example how we can use Laclau theory in very general sense, but also improve it with some specific analytical strategies to explore this kind of phenomenon. This was one of our main aim. The second is we somehow tried to avoid this kind of Lacanian approach to affect. We may discuss it later, but we thought that we didn't approach it in this particular book. But if we want to go forward with this affect theory, maybe there are some other authors that we can use to explain this kind of affective logic. For example, Jan Valsiner, who is world famous semiotic cultural psychologist who elaborate and use Lotmanian works to explain this kind of affective logic. Because at least for our point of view, Lacanian affect theory and Laclau discourse theory is two different kind of ontology. So what they put together, we are questioning this kind of approach. But of course, it's our problem, maybe.
Okay, thank you for that answer. It's very helpful to me. Yeah.
Just to resonate some points here, like the multiplicity or multitude of forms of hegemony was also very important for us. If we all remember the story that Chantal Mouffe has preaching since the 90s, I think that we should turn enemies into adversaries, and then we should have agonistic rather than antagonistic form of engagement and stuff like that. We wanted to bring out that there is a lot more different and often mutually constitutive democratic relations. You can have more or less totalitarian populism at some point engaging with deliberative democracy on the other. And these are different forms of hegemony. There's a multiplicity of nodal points. We could, I don't know, if say something along these lines.
Okay. Thank you. That's very helpful to my to myself, and good answer to my question. Thank you. I think just one more question, which might be a bit precise or very into detail, relates to the combination itself. So you are saying that these concepts of Laclau and Lotman are very similar, and I was thinking particularly about the similarity between the logics of difference and equivalence and Lotman's concept of the discrete and continuous coding system, whether they, I'm not quite sure whether they are really that similar as you are explaining. Maybe you can explain again how you think they are similar and how they can be related to each other. And I think maybe you should, to answer this question, might be helpful to kind of explain again what Lotman's coding systems actually means, or what is continuous coding and what discrete coding. Thank you.
I don't know, Anders, would you like to start or?
Maybe you can start and then I will continue.
Okay. So first of all, yes, the parallel which we actually drew here comes from Laclau's own discussion of metaphoric and metonymic articulation, and then how it's sort of gives an opportunity to see the logic of democracy, or democracy as meaning making, as being between two contradictory is not a good word here, alternative logics, but actually mutually presuming logics, how we move from constituting the people as one, as a transparent whole with natural foundations, and on the other extreme we have this multicultural logic of respecting the differences. And this is one of the things that he actually explicitly refers to Roman Jakobson at some point, distinguishing between the metaphoric and metonymic pole of language, especially when he discusses Paul de Man's contribution. And another thing is that there is always an essential tension within each discourse. You cannot, but you have to, in a certain sense, you cannot, but you both have to make certain differences equivalent in order for there to be a system of meaning in the first place. So this is the same logic. You cannot translate, in Lotman's terms now, you cannot translate discrete elements into a continuous whole and vice versa. But in a way, all those translation attempts take place all the time. So this is kind of like a unstable equilibrium or unstable order, if you like, that is characteristic of each meaning system. And Laclau and Mouffe's contribution was to point out that this logic is essentially a political logic. It's an issue of hegemony. How to construct the center so that they call it empty signifier at some point, so that the order is retroactively created through constructing a universal out of the particulars. So the essential tensions are all over the place. Lotman's notion is that there's untranslatability always involved in every act of translation, and for him, culture or communication is essentially translation in the widest sense.
Makes sense.
But Andreas, maybe you wanted to add something.
Yeah, important is that these coding system, discrete and non-discrete or continuous coding system, are based of every meaningful act of meaningful rating. Now, for example, just seeing, you perceive it continuously as a whole. But of course, if you translate it to your mind in verbal act, so to speak, you use discrete elements, verbal coding. But still, it's no. For example, these coding systems most explicitly explained in his article "Phenomenon of Culture," and now just last year it was translated first time in English. So I may send this compendium if someone interested in this particular article, because next year we have a 100-year anniversary of Yuri Lotman's, and so we have big translation going on at the moment to English and any other languages. But this is relational terms, because if when he brings some examples, for example, just our speech, what we do now is discrete, more discrete coding system. We use more discrete coding system. But comparing with, for example, poems, we much more move towards non-discrete, because there are huge amount and different kind of rules which show these poems as one whole. And again, comparing with poems, for example, movie, what we see from TV or cinema, each presented as a continuous whole. But of course, in a process of analyze, we can separate them discrete elements. This is an important aspect, and we can use it for analyze sake, so to speak.
Thank you.
Excellent. Do you still have something, Daniela, or should we open it up?
No, we can open up, of course. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for the answers, Andreas and Peter.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
We can both use the physical hand, the electronic hand, whichever you prefer. I see one hand up by Jason. Why don't you start us off?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Great. Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you very much, Peter and Andreas, for joining us. I'm actually really happy that you mentioned the Roskilde conference in 2008. You know, how we shared a panel there. It's so appropriate, because for me it was highly enlightening, really, to see what you've been doing since then, and particularly how you're trying to bring together the Essex School of Political Discourse Theory into dialogue with the Tartu-Moscow School. So yeah, I'm just really happy you're able to join us and to share your thinking with us, and also happy that we've got someone like Daniela who's really well positioned to help us continue to explore the dialogue. So I guess I've got some general comments. I've got, you know, it was really great to read the material and to listen to the presentation. It sort of set in train lots of thoughts and lots of trajectories that I would certainly like to explore a bit more. There are certainly very clear, very strong overlaps, very strong resonances. You know, I agree with a lot of what you say, particularly on the role of relationality, on the role of abduction and thinking about phenomena and the research process, and many other things, right? So there is definitely lots of overlap. So like Daniela's second question, I just want to really skip over a bit the more, like, say, affinities, the structural affinities and the synergies, and to see if we can explore some of the tensions in the kind of dialogue you're proposing. And I guess I got a couple of opening comments. One is more general, I guess, and one is a little more specific. The first one is, to what extent, let's say, would you see that your accounts of the phenomena, the puzzling phenomena that you're looking at, not only are seen as explanatory accounts, but also as critical accounts, right? So I'm sort of interested in kind of in a general sense, where you see the dimension of critique entering into your understanding of political semiotics. Yeah, so that's kind of a very general kind of comment or question, I guess. The second sort of comment or set of questions really has to do with this focus on form. Obviously, the form content distinction you drawn, overlaps and kind of share to a large extent. And I share certainly the focus on political forms, not just political contents. And so obviously this generates a couple of questions at least. One is, well, in the end, what role does content play at all in these accounts, right? And I think you hinted at that a bit earlier. Maybe it was Peter who was talking about the kind of mutual constitution of them, but just to say a bit more about the role that content in the end plays at all in political semiotics in the accounts. And then the second one is about form, because if I understand correctly, you're seeking to increase, let's say, the analytical, explanatory degrees of freedom by drawing on Jacobson's these 6 linguistic functions, and in a way using that really quite interestingly and productively as a way to pluralize the way that we think about political forms, right? So there are different ways of thinking about political forms and using Jacobson in that way. And so so this is the more particular question. So I'm particularly interested in the role, as you probably anticipate, in the role that the emotive and perhaps the phatic functions play here. And so it's a kind of a, maybe you're able to say something a bit more about these particular functions and how they relate to these other categories, either that you are developing, like, or that belong to the discourse theory school, we're talking about equivalence and difference, or more classical categories like ethos and pathos, rhetorical categories, or even I think the categories that were just mentioned very briefly here by Andreas is a very intriguing reference to affective logic. This idea of the affective logic, if I understood you correctly, which is being developed or has been developed by another Lotmanian scholar. So that's sort of a more specific type of question. I'll leave it there.
Okay, I can start. The general comment when it comes to explanation and criticism is that we see them as in that sense relational too, in a sense that we don't rule out that certain logics or certain forms of communication are always something to be dismissed as inimical to democracy. Having, for instance, phatic discourse on human rights is actually very important. If human rights were always on the agenda, they would be always contested. There would be they would be addressed in metalingual terms in Jacobson's sense. This would create much troubles, many troubles in a functioning, stable democracy. But what we argue, on the other hand, is that if there is only overwhelming phatic communication, we are only ritualized, we are only, having ready-made solutions for whatever societal problems without contesting them, then this would be equivalent to something we would call authoritarian populism. We always say, oh, we all know that, and stuff like that. But at the same time, it is important to have kind of like a fatigue ritualized, not very reflective, not very contested discourse on certain fundamentals of society, for instance, human rights, I just mentioned. So in that sense, critique is something different, I think, than in your book, when you presume that the basis of critique is basically democratic demand or something like that. We would argue that there's some certain heterogeneity in that multitude of forms can be compatible with democracy, but if one is prevailing totally, then we have different, let's say, democratic formation. And I would argue that during the crisis, deliberation, for instance, or metalingual contestation wouldn't always work. We sort of argue that problematization is to be preferred compared to deproblematization, which is a common strategy in politics when it comes to wicked problems. But we are not arguing that for all the problems there are in governance, problematization is always better than deproblematization. So they are contingent and kind of like related to the particular research interests. So about forms and content. Well, that's actually, now that I have been able to read our book, besides writing it, several things I would have done differently, actually, but still, we should have pointed out the historical relation to certain kind of Aristotelianism, let's say. In many sense, you could say that in Aristotelian framework, if you explain something, you explain, you can, well, he talked about heliomorphism and so on, mutual constitutional form and content, but in a sense, he had this primacy of form, or we could say the formal causes of phenomena, but it's a shame that we didn't point it out. This constitutive explanation we are talking about is actually, trying to reverse the history that since 18th century or so there is. When we talk about causality, we are talking about only the efficient causality, not what we could call formal causality, which is actually the constitution of phenomena. So if we explain something, we are not only looking for the origins, but we are looking for the very logic of its working. More specifically, emotive fatigue. Yes, our idea is actually, if you look at this graph we had, fatigue communication is sort of like we could say tamed affective or emotive communication, when we have certain stability, emotive communication, or which we relate to threat-based governance or like even totalitarian populism in some sense. It's something where what happens when the code breaks up. No, there's just this 9/11 changed everything kind of discourse going on and on. Fatigue is more like ritualized. We are unreflective, and in that sense, we have overwhelmingly like a metaphorical form of communication. Everything is basically the same. In Laclau and Moff's logic, we could say that this is a total prevalence of logic of equivalence. So everyone, every element can be substituted with everything. There is no distinction, there is no reflection whatsoever, but we kind of have some sort of stability, and that's kind of our. We tried to put the categories of Jakobson into their place, because Jakobson just presented them. He didn't have any internal logic in terms of, equivalence or difference or metaphorical, metonymic. He talked about these things in different places. So that's what we tried to do, and we actually polemize Jakobson's own understandings even when doing that. So I don't know, Andres, would you like to add here something?
I just maybe will add something about the second question about affect and Jan Valsiner. Jan Valsiner elaborated his theory using also Lotman, but his main author that he used is Charles Sanders Peirce, and these categories of icon, index, symbol, and also firstness, secondness, and thirdness. And this icon is basically based on meaning-making process, very basic meaning-making process, which based on similarity. For example, a portrait or photo of you is similar to you, so to speak. And we can relate it with Lotman concept of or coding system of continuous coding system. So, and why we think that this is maybe more connectable with this kind of semiotic or even discourse theories, that if we handle affect and discourse absolutely separated, like for example Deleuze-Guattari and Masumi do, then there are no chance to analyze it, what this affect really is. We want to show that this kind of symbolic level also have some kind of impact to firstness level or icon level, and this can be united with Lotmanian continuous coding system or non-discrete coding system. But as we already told that we haven't elaborated yet, but we have good chance because just this year we have a original professor in our department, Jan Valsiner, just 1 year. So I have already started to discuss about this kind of combination, how to put together this kind of affect theory that he elaborated already, and our political semiotic approach, and also related with this emotive and empathic communication type elaborated by Roman Jakobson. This is just preliminary ideas. Important is that maybe this kind of approach gives us possibility to approach this kind of affective semiosis more analytically or something like that. If we say that all is unconsciousness, then there are no chance to touch it, so to speak. of course, it's just a different ontology. If it lies on ontology of Peirce, that this kind of every meaning-making process consists all these levels: firstness, secondness, and thirdness, or icon, index, and symbol, then we can do it. If there are also other possibility to interpret Peircean triads. So, but if you stay this kind of approach, then maybe we can achieve some results. I don't know.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Anyone wanting to jump in? I see a hand of David. Did I see that correctly? Yeah, go ahead.
If there are people who have questions, please go ahead, because I feel a little bit like an imposter. I'm at the moment in my own seminar because currently I'm on research leave, enjoying research leave, I should say. And so I also plead guilty, the classic student guilty plea of I haven't read the text yet. So I've been preoccupied with various other things, and so, but this discussion has certainly stimulated me even further to get to grips with your text and to read it very carefully, and I'm looking forward to that when I have some time. So my questions are going to be based mainly on your presentation and the discussion so far, if that's okay. But it's also, I'm prompted by the thought of your talk about the research interests. And in fact, your presentation, certainly the beginning, very much touches on my current research interests. So it's very, very useful for me. And so what I really wanted to talk a bit about was your sort of overriding, at a more concrete level, let's say, at your focus on governance. And I like this idea of thinking about governance in terms of power exercised to address problems, and then your discussion of problems themselves. And I'm sort of going back a little bit to the beginning with your sort of typology of problems, with this axis of the disagreement agreement element. And really what intrigues me a lot here is this notion of deproblematization. What do you mean? And you stress this element, this idea of deproblematization. And so I really want to invite you to say a little bit more about that aspect of problems in the light perhaps of, first of all, some debates that have been going on about depoliticization. So what is the relationship between deproblematization and this literature on depoliticization, which takes various forms, I'm sure, as you know. And then what I'd like also, if possible, you could give us a kind of an example of deproblematization as you see it. And in particular, what kinds of mechanisms or logics are at play in this production of deproblematization, which I take to be that there is disagreement about the definition of a problem or an issue, but there is ultimately some agreement in terms of the solution to the problem, right? If I've got it right. And so that invites me, the thought from my point of view, and let's say from Jason and I's point of view, from a logics point of view, you know, how might we start thinking about this movement from disagreement about definitions, but agreement about solutions? And I was thinking there, you know, one level it might be that just the problem gets solved in some way, right? And one could think of many examples perhaps where solutions come up to problems, societal problems. But in fact, I would suggest from a sociological point of view, that's becoming increasingly rare that we ever have these solutions to these problems, because when we have, as I take it, a situation of a major problem, there's usually a clash of values involved, and those values kind of never go away. So it's quite rare. I mean, I was thinking in the case of vaccinations, I was thinking, you know, well, what would be a problem that would have a solution that we would all agree about? And I was thinking, well, vaccinations. that, you know, most people would surely agree that we would need to have a vaccination against measles, mumps, rubella, polio. But now, of course, COVID, as you mentioned, we have major disputes about vaccinations, right? So even an issue like that seems to be resolved. Actually, it opens up a clash of values. Or it could be displaced, the problem could be displaced, or it could be sort of concealed, right? We think that the problem has been resolved. But in fact, it's really, and from our point of view, this might be the role of ideology coming into play, that the role of the ideological is to sort of conceal and to produce a kind of sense, a false deproblematization, let's say. False is a difficult word, but certainly a concealing moment, a moment of concealment of the problem. So that might be a kind of mechanism that might be exploited in terms of thinking about issues of power and so on. So really, what I would invite you to say is, you know, what does the semiotic dimension, the cultural semiotic dimension of your approach, how does that, as it were, contribute, let's say, to this thinking about deproblematization and the resolution or the agreement about problems? Those are my thoughts. I find it very, very interesting talk, very stimulating, and I'm very glad to see you here and opening up this interaction that we're having here.
Thank you very much, David. I just was kind of wondering, are you sure you haven't read the text? Because you kind of were
maybe my unconscious
in many ways.
But I don't think so. I haven't, not to my consciousness.
Yeah, depoliticization and deproblematization, they are intimately and explicitly related in these particular pages, but I would even say that there's more coming up. We are actually writing a book now with colleagues in Tallinn University, which we call provocatively failure governance. It's or from governance failure to failure governance, and actually the issue of displacement of problems, ideological concealing and so on are pretty much to the point. We are trying to talk about the semiotic mechanisms that are used in deproblematizing problems. When you make something from, for instance, from an object of discussion into an object of ritualized reaction, then you deproblematize it. You have a kind of what Lotman and others are calling methodological consciousness prevailing in public discourse. Many things are beyond problematization, or as people like Colin Hay and others would say, beyond politicization. So these notions are quite intimately related, but we wanted to point out again this multiplicity of perspectives. Sometimes to deproblematize something is very important. So we are taking things off the agenda, so to speak. We are hegemonically defining them, or even if we don't understand all the details and the intricacies of human rights, for instance, we are taking them off the agenda because, you know, for us, the issue whether we should have human rights respected or not is not an issue. But when it comes to wicked problems, then we argue that problematization, or for that matter, even politicization, is something to be preferred compared to depoliticization or deproblematization, at least when we try to be sustainable. Because when you mentioned vaccination, yeah, well, everybody agrees, but not everybody. One of 1/3 of our Western population, or at least in Estonia, I don't know how it's in Britain, but definitely in the United States, about 1/3, they are completely disregarding this as an option. But what would be deproblematization here would be making something like vaccination not available but mandatory, to force them. You treat a wicked problem, which is a problem of epistemic authority, as we argue, as if it were solvable and so solvable problem. But our point is something along these lines, that we are actually not getting what is underlying this lack of vaccination in the Western world. There is no agreement on the problem definition here, but there are many voices who would make, mostly medical people, who would make it mandatory like that, so they would deproblematize it. So you don't have to understand it, just vaccinate, and that then all the issue will be this issue will be resolved. But actually, it in all likelihood, it's going to have huge backfires if we did something like that. If we totally deproblematize the issue of vaccination, the issue of epistemic authority, and would make it mandatory, then probably the consequences would be even more dire than they are now. So that's sort of like the stuff we are partly speculating, but actually empirically trying to study in our forthcoming book. But the semiotic mechanisms, yeah, there was the same 6 functions we tried to think about it. There is a one axis that moves towards problematization when you put things into discrete terms. There is another tendency if you put them in a very equivalential terms, and that at some point, if you totally deproblematize all societal problems, you just have those emotions just floating around, and there is no questioning, no responding, no, everything is concealed, so to speak, yeah, ideologically. So again,
we brought just one example in our book, analysis of problems which arose with our ID card. It was in 2018, if I remember, 17, yes. And very quickly it was deproblematized as some kind of technical problem. And they start to talk about only in the level of how it's impact to our international images. Because we know that Estonia, at least from our self-description point of view, a very well established e-state. So we have different kind of e-election and so on. But basically, if we talk very emotionally about how it's impact very negatively to our national identity, international level. So the solution was, don't talk about it anymore. No one talk about as technical problem. Everyone talk about as a problem for our national images. And how to solve this problem in the international level, don't talk about it. So this is maybe an example how we deproblematized using this kind of emotional and fatigue communicative type as dominant types of communication about this course.
No. And
because we are very well push this point that it's harm to our national identity. It's a fatigue communication, and how this kind of discourse was articulated was used very much this kind of emotional strategies, or which push this emotional strategy in the front. It's a threat and whatever.
Yeah. And
I think we have time for, like, I would say one more round of question and one more round of replies, if that is okay. So if anyone else has a question, please make yourself heard. I definitely still have one, but I also want to give the opportunity to anyone else to jump in if they want to.
I'd like to say something.
Yeah, go ahead, and then I'll add my question afterwards, and then we can get the replies together. I think that would be helpful.
Thank you. Well, hi. Special thanks to the authors. I very much enjoyed the reading, and in particular the part of abductive reasoning. It is very, very pedagogical, and I really buy the idea of how in inductive reasoning as well as in deductive reasoning you have this independence from one premise to the other, whereas in abductive reasoning they're interdependent. So this is just a question of clarification. Bottom line, when it comes to retroductive or abductive reasoning, would you say that theory comes first in terms of a preconception with which you see something? And if so, how does that modify the idea of going back and forth from premise to conclusion? This is actually just a common / open-ended question. Thank you.
And my question relates to the role of the material in political semiotics, which I'm just curious about. I was just wondering, because discourse theorists, they acknowledge that the material plays an important role, but very few people actually deal with it in any detail. There's maybe Nico Carpentier as one of the few ones who have actually tried to use the material, the intricacies between the material and the discursive to provide theory and explanation. So I'm just curious about what is the role of the material in political semiotics, cultural semiotics, Lotman?
Okay, I will start with the abductive logic. You know, theory doesn't come first let's say you have to start at some point. You have some sort of background knowledge when it comes to theories, but it is articulated during the abductive process. So we could say that there's a mutual constitution of premises and inferences and conclusions. So and also the background knowledge can change due to that. The facts can change, because what used to be a surprising fact at some point ceases to be one, but it can re-emerge. So actually the quote I didn't want to bother you with from Dewey and Bentley is that the systems of description and naming are always kind of like preliminary. They are constantly re-articulated during the research process. So they are not given, but at some point you have to, I think it was explicitly also discussed in Jason's and David's book that you have to reach a certain judgment, so that now you kind of have created the categories that actually explain the phenomenon, but this judgment is never beyond contestation. It's not just testing a hypothesis and seeing that it was confirmed or rejected. It's kind of like, as I understand it, a more processual approach, processual research, so that the final results are part of the culture you are studying, actually. So something along these lines. When it comes to material, well, it reminds me of this epigram of a Polish satirist, but unfortunately I don't know whether there is an official English translation of that available. But the idea is more or less that when a myth clashes with another myth, the clash is very real. So it's like the distinction between material and ideal, or ideation for that matter, as Laclau and Mouffe and people who follow them, this distinction doesn't actually make much sense anymore, because the realm of discourse is also the material practices and action in the last instance. That's the thing, that if you study the interpretations of somebody as Beaver and Rhodes, I know you criticized them in your book, but anyway, but as they say that beliefs are constitutive of action, and so in that sense, material is always there. We are not studying the expressions of the world, we are studying the constitution of the world, and that's one of the maybe takeaway points. Semiotics is not about studying, as the usual story goes, how we express ourselves. It's how we constitute ourselves in actual material consequences. So I don't know, that's my take on these issues, but maybe Andres, you'd like to add something.
I agree with Peter, yes. I have no more comments.
Okay, excellent. Then I thank you very much to both Peter and Andreas for coming. Thank everyone for joining. Hope it was as
you very much for
inviting us for me. And I wish everyone a nice Friday evening and a good weekend.
Yeah, thank you very much again. And hopefully we can meet again more often than every 13 years or so.
That would be great. Okay, bye.